Okay, Spatial Shark is back with video 7 in the Unit 3 slideshows, and we're continuing on with language today. Particularly today we're going to be talking about language families. So we'll start off with this pretty simple to understand pie chart. It shows you some of the bigger language families in the world. Not that you're going to need to know every single language family on earth. Remember, there are 7,000 languages being spoken, and they're grouped into 20, 30 different language families, but these are the big ones. And as you can clearly see, there are two mega big ones. Half the people in the world speak something that is Indo-European. 1/4 of the world speaks something that is Sino-Tibetan, and then about the other quarter of the world speaks the other families. And then you see that other there is 3% of the world. So we could work from Indo-European. These are obviously stretching from India to Europe. And again, half of humanity. That's mostly because of colonization. We'll talk about that in the slideshow. Sino-Tibetan, the prefix Sino always means Chinese. So that's an indication right there that we're talking about Mandarin speakers plus the other areas of East Asia. And then we start working our way down Afro-Asiatic. That's where Arabic comes from. You've got the Austronesian speakers, which is the area that is primarily Indonesia and beyond. You have Dravidian, which is the southern cone of India. You've got both Altaic and Niger-Congo, who are about 3% of the world. Altaic is Turkey, mostly Turkish, but some other languages in that part of Central Asia. And then, of course, you've got the Niger-Congo, which is basically from the Niger River in West Africa all the way down to the Congo River in southern Central Africa. And then finally, Japanese in a family all by itself. Japanese is a very unusual language. There is some research nowadays that says that Japanese and Altaic are kind of related to each other. But like families in your life, you know, you're closer to some relatives than maybe to others. So we're going to talk about how these families are related, how the languages within them are related based on common characteristics. So this is a kind of an interesting part of the slideshow where we talk about language diversity. So basically, if you take that pie chart that I just showed you and you put it on a map instead, you see the color coding of the different language families. And of course, if you look in the Western Hemisphere, you see a predominance of Indo-European. And again, mostly because of European colonization, Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, all coming over to the Western Hemisphere. Some other big pockets. Obviously, you can see the Sino-Tibetan in China. You can see the Indo-European that's also all across Europe itself and heading down towards South Asia. You can see the Dravidian in the cone, like I mentioned. You can see the Afro-Asiatic from the Middle East all the way across Africa, especially northern Africa. And then you see the Niger-Congo that is basically sub-Saharan. Clearly, there are also a lot of smaller ones, much more geographically compact families that are only found in certain parts of the world. It would be good for you to kind of get an idea of where these big families are located, what the source areas are, how have they diffused, if they've diffused, why didn't they diffuse, if they didn't diffuse. Those kinds of questions would be what test item writers are thinking about when they create questions for you on the AP exam. So let's start with the big one, right? Remember, this is half the world. The most widely dispersed language family, Indo-European. Within families, we then start to subdivide into groups of languages that will be very closely related. Not necessarily mutually intelligible, although sometimes they can be somewhat. What we're saying here is that these languages in groups are going to be more closely related than just languages that happen to be in the same family. Kind of like how you might be more related to siblings than you are to cousins. And, you know, when we say cousins, this is where Mrs. Turner and I, we always have fun. Because remember, my mom's one of 7. So I've got like 26 first cousins. My wife has 3. Right? So it's kind of a debate. You know, when you start getting to second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin, in my world, you know, yeah, they're your cousin, but they're so far away from me. I got so many first cousins, I don't know where they all start and stop. So when you think about languages, sometimes they're more related and sometimes they're less related. Of all of the Indo-European languages, English typically is ranked as the biggest of these languages, although lately Spanish is giving it a run for the money because we know know that fertility rates in Latin American countries and in Spanish-speaking countries tends to be a little higher. But aside from that debate, we need to understand that English is widely used as a second language in the world, and clearly billions of people know it. But Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, is still by far the biggest language spoken in the world. And again, that's because of China's massive population. You might ask, why then does India's language not have such a great status of number of speakers? And that's because India doesn't have one big dominant language. Hindi is by far the biggest, but it's not widespread in every single part of India. There's also Marathi speakers, Gujarati speakers. There's a whole nother language family in the southern cone of India. So we'll talk about India in more detail. Basically, when you start talking about the big ones in Indo-European, we group them either into Romance, and all of those are going to be based on Latin. So there are 5. Think of like your fingers on your hand. Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian. Those are your 4 fingers. Don't forget your thumb. Romanian is Romance, and the name gives it away. Romania's language is Latin-based too. Then you look at the Germanic group, and you've got obviously German, and then you have Dutch, and you have Danish, and Swedish, and Norwegian, and Icelandic, and Irish, the Gaelic languages. But then, of course, remember, English comes from the Germanic group. Even though we have a big Latin infusion because of William the Conqueror invading the UK, what became the UK in 1066. Then you've got that Balto-Slavic group. Russian's the big one there. But then you have Polish, and you have Ukrainian, which sounds very much like Russian, by the way. You have Bulgarian, and you have Serbo-Croatian, and you have a bunch of those languages that are in the Balto-Slavic group. Don't forget that Indo-European also has that huge part that is from the subcontinent of India. So Persian, Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, all of those come from that Indo-Iranian part. Greek kind of all by itself within the Indo-European family. Albanian kind of by itself, Armenian kind of by itself. Those languages, very, very old. The hypothesis is that these languages started in the Caucasus mountain area between the Black and the Caspian Seas, and then one went this way and one went that way, and then it began to change. So here are your big languages by number of speakers. Again, Mandarin, very big. You'll notice that this chart has Spanish higher. Some charts will have English higher. Arabic, Hindi, Bengali, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese. Notice these 2 languages will not be in the top much longer, because if you remember from Unit 2, and you can't learn and dump in an AP Human Geography class, those populations, remember, are old and declining, so those languages will not be amongst the biggest for much longer. So what are these European languages? You can read through this. It gives you some examples of Indo-European. And also, you got to remember, not everybody in Europe speaks an Indo-European language. Hungarian and Finnish speakers, those languages sound very, very different to the rest of Europe. Those come from a Uralic family, from the Ural Mountains of Russia. The Altaic, there's an Altai mountain range out by Mongolia and Kazakhstan. That's where Turkish comes from. You've got Celtic speakers that are older than the Indo-European invaders, and that's why Celtic got pushed out into Ireland and Scotland. You've got the Romans who bring in their Latin, and that's, of course, what gives us the Romance languages. You've got language isolates like Basque. We're not even really sure where it comes from, but we know it's old, and it's secluded up in the mountains of the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And we know that Europe has a very high correlation between borders and language, with exceptions. Spain is multilingual. France is multilingual. The UK is multilingual. Belgium does not have its own language. There's no such thing as being Belgian. You're either Flemish speaker or you're a Walloon speaker in Belgium. Flemish is like Dutch. Walloon is like French. Switzerland does not have its own language. You've got French speakers in Switzerland, German speakers in Switzerland, Italian speakers in Switzerland, and then, of course, you have one that's called Romansh, tiny little language, again, way up high in the mountains. Czechs and Slovaks, different language. That's why the country of Czechoslovakia didn't exactly work out. Czechs wanted to be Czech, and Slovaks wanted to be Slovaks, and therefore they decided in the 90s they were just going to have a velvet divorce and split their country in 2. So this map gives you a pretty good idea of language diversity throughout Europe. Here's a tip for Unit 4 when we get into political geography. Those parts of European countries that don't speak the majority language, like Catalan speakers in Spain, hey, that's also where there's places where people want to break away and create their own countries. So, Catalonia wanting to advocate for independence. Scottish and Welsh speakers within the UK not happy about Brexit and saying, hey, maybe we should just break away and create our own country. The breakup of the Yugoslavia into Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, because there's a part of Greece that's Macedonian, and Greece didn't want the Macedonian country to say, hey, all Macedonian people should be part of Macedonia. All right, so again, it can be confusing, but basically just keep track of where these languages are. In South Asia, Hindi by far is the biggest, but you do have, of course, other Indo-European languages in the northern part of India. You've also got the Dravidian cone in the south. Telugu, Tamil are the two biggest ones there. India is so linguistically divided that a long time ago, the government said, let's start creating multiple official languages. The problem with having so many official is that what if you're the 22nd biggest language group? You've made 21 languages official. Doesn't the 22nd group now feel left out because their language is not going to be elevated to the same status? India is like Europe in the sense that every time you cross a border between one Indian state to the next, you probably change language too. Pakistan, Bangladesh on either side of India, they also have unique languages. Pakistan is multilingual as well. Urdu is the biggest one. Fun fact about Urdu, it sounds the same as Hindi, but it's a completely different written alphabet. And one thing about South Asia, because of colonization and educational and government systems, almost everybody in South Asia that's educated has English. So English is sometimes like a Band-Aid that holds these areas together linguistically, economically, and politically. So basically, here's your map, just kind of reiterating what we just talked about on the previous slide. You can obviously pause and you can take a look at that and see some of the variations that go across this region of South Asia. Africa, the most linguistically divided region of the world. Remember, we talked about Papua New Guinea being very linguistically fragmented as a country. Africa, over 1,000 languages being spoken, none of which are considered to be major, and that's because Africa is very tribal. So remember, Africa didn't draw African boundaries. The African people didn't draw those boundaries. Those boundaries were superimposed by white European colonizers, and they didn't care whether tribal groups got lumped together with people they didn't want to be with, or if they got split apart from people that they did want to be with. So the language map of Africa and the political map of Africa do not correlate very highly. And that is a big problem of holding African countries together and creating national identity and national unity. What does it mean to be Nigerian when there's 500 languages being spoken in Nigeria? The biggest language family in Africa is Niger-Congo, but you also have Khoisan in the extreme southern cone of Africa. Those are the Click languages. You have a Nilo-Saharan family that's up around the Nile, hence the name Nilo-Saharan. So there's a bunch of these other ones. Swahili is a big tribal language related to the Bantu migrations. It is a killer language. It is wiping out smaller indigenous tribal languages, but it is not foreign to Africa. It's a native African language. English and Arabic came in from the outside. Swahili is a uniquely African language, but no less a killer. And again, here's the map that's just reiterating what we were just talking about. Moving on, talking about Chinese. Mandarin, of course, is dominated by the government in Beijing, but there are a lot of regional variations of Chinese, and they are not always mutually intelligible. When we went to China, our guide from Beijing needed help when we went to Shanghai. When we went to Hong Kong, he needed a translator to help him with the local dialect. But even if you only limit Chinese to Mandarin speakers, it's still by far the biggest language in the world by native speakers. And here's the map. Chinese didn't spread all around the world like Indo-European languages did, mostly because China politically and economically didn't decide to colonize the way European countries did. So remember that like a family tree, languages diverge and they spread apart. And over time and over distance, those languages are going to become different. There's going to be variations. We call those regional variations dialects. But sometimes languages can also converge. So this is kind of just a way to show the world language family tree. The branches of the tree are the families. The leaves of the tree are the actual languages. They're grouped together by their groups, and the size of the leaf is going to tell you how many speakers in millions speak those languages. Notice these numbers will not be super reliable. Notice the date, 1999. It's an old textbook, but it was the best picture that I could find to show you how these language family trees kind of look. But that's interesting to look at as well. In the United States, of course, our biggest linguistic minority is Spanish speakers. Hispanics are now in excess of 15% of the U.S. population. The new census this next year, 2020, probably will show that they've gained even more. Remember that white European ethnic Americans are not going to be the majority for much longer. There'll be a plurality. So the census is reflecting that Hispanics are growing. So there is this push to make Spanish equally official to English in the United States. But the catch is English is not even official. We don't have an official language in the United States. We've never passed a law and said, hey, let's make English official. Some states have made English official. Some states are officially bilingual. The reality is that Spanish wouldn't be equally official because of the great numbers of Hispanics across the entire country, but it would make sense in places like California, Texas, Florida, even to some degree New York and Illinois, because of the large Hispanic population in big cities like Chicago and New York City. But when 40% of California is Spanish speaking, they're making a compelling case that, hey, maybe Spanish should be used more. Others argue, hey, every immigrant group to America has had to acculturate. They've had to come to the United States and get ahead economically, and learning the language is a big part of that. So that's a big debate that's going on socially and politically in a lot of different parts of the United States. Okay, we're almost at 17 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up. A little bit long this time. Hopefully YouTube will still let me post this. This is the biggest part of the language unit. I'll come back the next video and we'll talk about toponyms and place names and how people argue over the names of places.